Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Nelson, and I'll be speaking to you today about open source. Open source is a computer software with its source code made available with a license, in which the copyright holder provides the rights to study, change, and distribute the software to anyone and for any purpose. As well, it is the most prominent example of open source development. The open source model, or collaborative development from multiple independent sources, generates an increasingly more diverse scope of design perspective than any one company is capable of developing and sustaining long term. A 2008 report by the Standish Group states that adoption of open source software models has resulted in savings of about $60 billion per year to consumers. The open source notion moved to the wayside of commercialization of software in the years 1970 through 1980. But in 1997, Eric Raymond published The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is a reflective analysis of the hacker community and free software principles. The paper received significant attention in early 1998 and was one factor in motivating Netscape Communications Corporation to release their popular Netscape Communicator Internet Suite as free software. This was the beginning of not only free software ideas, but the commercial software industry as well. In his 1997 essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, open source revolutionist Eric S. Raymond suggests a model for developing OSS known as the Bazaar model. Unlike the traditional model of development, which he called the cathedral model, the Bazaar model strays from having variables clearly defined. The first pattern suggests the users are created like co-developers, and they should have access to the source code of the software. Furthermore, users are encouraged to submit additions to the software, code fixes for the software, bug reports, documentation, etc. Having more co-developers increases the rate at which software evolves, and as a result, if many users are able to view the source code, they will eventually find all bugs and suggest how to fix them. The first version of the software should be released as early as possible to increase one's chances of finding co-developers early. In order to keep the software efficient, it's crucial that proper developers are ready for support. Code changes should be integrated, or in other words, merged into a shared code base as often as possible, so as to avoid the overhead of fixing a large number of bugs at the end of the project lifecycle. Some open source projects have nightly builds where integration is done automatically on a daily basis. There should be at least two versions of the software. More specifically, there should be a buggier version with more features and a more stable version with fewer features. The buggy version, also called the development version, is for users who want the immediate use of the latest features and yet are willing to accept the risk of using code that is not yet thoroughly tested. And finally, the general structure of the software should be modular, allowing for a parallel development on independent components. That makes strategic decisions dependent on ever-changing user requirements as well as other factors. So, some advantages to open source. The biggest advantage to open source are that the software is usually easier to obtain than proprietary software, often resulting in increased usage. It has also helped to build developer loyalty, as developers feel empowered and have a sense of ownership of the end product. And there are generally lower marketing and logistical costs to maintaining open source software. And although things are great with open source, there are some disadvantages. While open source has high upside, some software experts and researchers are not convinced by the open source's ability to produce quality systems, specifically regarding the unclear process open source software has. It is also difficult to design a commercially sound business model around the open source paradigm because of the multiple co-developers. And as a result, it gives opportunities for hackers to identify weaknesses or loopholes within the software. Here are some leading competitors within open source. Now on to Open Source of America. Continuing with current contributors to open source, Open Source for America is a group created to raise awareness in the United States federal government about the benefits of open source software. Their missions are to encourage the government's use of open source software, participation in open source software projects, incorporation of open source community, which would increase government transparency. Some notable trends within open source indicate that open source is a ground zero for technology development, that the cloud is eating open source applications, that big internet companies are huge open source contributors, and finally, security has become a major sore point for open source. Here are some recent headlines about open source in the news. Thank you everyone today for listening about open source. We'll see you next time.